A gray, ordinary evening. The city was covered in clouds, and as usual, I was stuck in traffic. On my way home, I could only dream of a hot shower and a warm blanket. Home was a quiet refuge, always a place to hide from the hustle and bustle. But that day, the refuge betrayed me. When I entered, Thomas, my stepfather, was standing in the hallway. Usually, he was barely noticeable. Quiet, calm, lost in his thoughts. Today was different. He was standing by the kitchen table, arms crossed, as if waiting for me. On the table were 2 cups of coffee, one of which was mine. "You're here," he said too calmly. His voice, usually lifeless, sounded strangely animated. This caused a slight unease. "Yes. Did something happen?" I put my bag by the wall and looked at him, waiting for an explanation. Thomas smiled. His smile didn't reach his eyes, but it lingered a bit too long. "I just wanted to talk," he replied, pulling out a chair. "Sit down." Something in his tone made me freeze. It was as if someone invisible had placed a weight on my shoulders. I sat down across from him, feeling my heart beat a little faster. "About what?" I asked, trying to seem indifferent. "About you, Ellie. About us, about life." His words sounded too measured, as if rehearsed. The air between us grew thick. He looked at me too intently, and I averted my gaze as if I had violated a rule he hadn't voiced. "Have you ever thought," Thomas continued, tilting his head, "how one word or action can change everything? The whole course of life? Destiny?" I frowned. His words sounded like a riddle, but there was something more behind them. "No, I haven't," I muttered, feeling the tension rise. Thomas took a sip of coffee, not taking his eyes off me. A shadow of a smile flashed across his face. "But I have," he said finally. "Sometimes everything changes in one evening, even in 1 minute." I tried to smile, but the corners of my lips betrayed me, trembling. Thomas's words clung to me like thorns, leaving no chance to escape their sensation. The whole scene looked strange. A stepfather who rarely spoke more than a few words suddenly talking about fate and change. "Is this some kind of philosophy or—" I began, but he interrupted me. "Not quite. It's a thought." He fell silent, as if pondering whether to continue. "And sometimes it's just interesting what a person will do if given the chance to change, how they will act." At that moment, the kitchen became too quiet. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed distant. I wanted to say something, but Thomas stood up, looked into his cup, and somewhat absent-mindedly said, "Well, I think I'll go. We'll talk more later." His words were like a promise, but they only made me feel colder. Thomas took his cup and left, leaving me alone at the table. I sat there for a few more minutes, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. Its ticking grew louder, drowning out even my own thoughts. What did he mean? Why did his words sound so ominous? I stood up, deciding to go to my room, but before that, I noticed something strange. Under the cup from which I hadn't taken a single sip, there was a note. A small white sheet, neatly folded in half. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. On it were just 3 words. "It's only beginning." At that moment, something inside me snapped. Thomas had left me not just a note, but a message that carried too many questions. And no answers. The morning began quietly. Too quietly. The house always seemed like a peaceful place to me, but today this peace was out of place, unsettling. As if everything that happened yesterday had changed the usual rhythm of life. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, trying to distract myself from my thoughts. Thomas was nowhere to be seen, but this didn't relax me. On the contrary, it increased the tension. My cup of coffee sat in front of me, but I hadn't taken a single sip. I couldn't. His words still echoed in my head. Sometimes everything changes in one evening. Even in 1 minute. Why did he say that? And why did the note with those strange words appear under my cup? Was it a joke? A warning? Or something else I was afraid to think about? By noon, Thomas finally emerged from his room. His appearance was disgustingly ordinary. He was in sweatpants and a t-shirt, with slightly tousled hair. In one hand, he held his phone, and in the other, a cup. Ordinary, boring Thomas. The way I had known him all these years. But now something had changed. Something in the way he looked at me. "You're up early," he noted, looking at me as if I were part of some experiment. "I wanted to finish some work," I replied, not taking my eyes off my phone. He slowly approached the table, his steps sounding hollow in the silence of the house. I felt him sit down across from me, but I didn't look up. I couldn't. It felt like his gaze was burning through me like a spotlight, searching for something. "Is everything okay?" he asked, and his voice sounded too soft, almost tender. I couldn't suppress a nervous smile. "Yes. Why do you ask?" He shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "You just seem a bit tense. Maybe I should apologize for last night? Sometimes I talk too much." I finally looked up at him. He looked absolutely innocent, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that there was something more behind that mask. "It's fine," I muttered. "I'm just tired." He nodded and stood up, clearly pleased with himself. Before leaving the kitchen, Thomas paused in the doorway and threw over his shoulder. "I'll make dinner tonight." "I hope you don't mind." I wanted to refuse, but for some reason I just nodded. Something in his voice made refusal impossible. The whole day passed in a haze. I tried to work, but I couldn't concentrate. Every rustle, every sound in the house made me jump. I even checked the door to my room several times to make sure it was locked. By evening, I heard Thomas bustling in the kitchen. There were sounds of vegetables being chopped, the clatter of pots. Everything looked normal. But that's what scared me. As if he was deliberately creating this illusion of familiarity. "Ellison, dinner's ready," he called. I didn't want to go, but hunger took over. Besides, I knew that refusing would only make things worse. On the table were 2 dishes, some kind of pasta with sauce. Thomas was sitting across from me, already eating. "Sit down," he invited, gesturing to the chair across from him. I sat down, trying to hide my discomfort. We ate in silence, and the silence seemed deafening. Thomas suddenly broke it, saying a phrase that made me freeze. "I'm glad we're finally spending time together. We're family, right?" "Of course," I replied, trying to seem indifferent. He smiled. And again, that smile, strange, unkind, as if he knew something I didn't. When I went up to my room, I locked the door and leaned against it with relief. My hands were slightly trembling. My heart was pounding. What's wrong with me? Why am I so afraid of him? He hasn't done anything bad. Yet. I turned on the music, hoping to drown out my thoughts, but after a couple of minutes, I heard a knock. Soft, barely audible, but it was there. I tensed up. "Ellison, are you asleep?" Thomas's voice sounded muffled through the door. I didn't know what to answer. Intuition screamed not to open up, but silence could only make things worse. "No," I finally said. "Is something wrong?" "I wanted to ask if you're okay. You seemed upset today." "I'm fine, just tired." "Good. If you need anything, I'm here," he said, but he didn't leave. I heard his footsteps only after a few seconds, but even after he left, I couldn't relax. Something was wrong. I felt it with every fiber of my being. When I finally lay down in bed, my thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. All of this couldn't be a simple coincidence. Thomas is watching me. He knows I can feel it. But what does he want? Before going to sleep, I thought about one thing. I need to talk to Mom urgently. But how do I explain what I couldn't fully understand myself? The world outside the window seemed so distant that it was scary. The wind howled in the treetops, casting faint reflections of moving shadows on the walls. This sound, which used to seem cozy to me, now evoked a strange feeling, as if someone was hiding behind every corner. The house, which had always been a quiet refuge, suddenly felt like a cage. I decided to distract myself and went downstairs. The kitchen was too sterile, too perfect. Spotlessly clean surfaces, neatly placed cups. It was as if someone had carefully prepared this space for a show where I was the only audience. When Thomas entered, I felt it long before his steps echoed in the hallway. It felt like the air around had changed, grown denser. He stopped in the doorway, his hands behind his back, and just looked at me. "Are you okay?" He asked as if he already knew the answer. "Of course," I replied, trying to sound calm. "That's good." His voice was soft, almost tender, but something in it made me tense up. He slowly walked to the table and sat down across from me. Usually, Thomas was a person you barely noticed, but now I felt every gesture, every movement of his. He was too real. "You know I'm always here to help, right?" he said, not taking his eyes off me. "Yes, of course," I nodded, looking anywhere but at him. "Great," he drawled, as if savoring every second of this strange conversation. "It's important that we can trust each other." Those words stuck in my head like a broken record. Thomas stood up, went to the sink, and began slowly washing the cup he hadn't even filled. I couldn't take it anymore and stood up, trying to move calmly, even though everything inside me screamed to just run out of the room. "Ellison." His voice sounded as I was already standing on the stairs. "Are you sure everything is okay?" I froze for a moment but didn't turn around. "Absolutely," I replied, trying to give my voice a firmness I didn't feel. My room was the only place where I could feel relatively safe. I locked the door, but even that didn't help. In my head, his voice still echoed. We should trust each other. Why did he say it as if it were not a suggestion, but an order? At some point, I realized I was holding my phone in my hands. I dialed Mom's number, but before I could press call, I stopped. What would I tell her? That her husband is acting strangely? That he looks at me as if he knows something I don't? It all sounded too absurd. I put the phone back on the nightstand and lay down on the bed. No more than 10 minutes had passed when there was a knock. Soft, almost careful, but distinct. I tensed up. "Ellison, can I come in?" Thomas's voice was muffled, but his words echoed through the room like thunder in the silence. I forced myself to exhale. "I'm tired, Thomas. Maybe we can talk tomorrow?" I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "Of course I won't bother you," he said. But I didn't hear footsteps moving away from the door. His presence behind the door was palpable, as if he were looking straight through it. I pressed my back against the bed, clenching my fists until I heard him finally leave. But even after the silence enveloped the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night would be long. Something was wrong. I knew it with every fiber of my being. The silence in the house was so absolute that even the sound of water dripping from the kitchen faucet seemed deafening. I sat in my room, trying to focus on the laptop screen, but every line of text blurred before my eyes. Only one thought kept spinning in my head. Why is he acting so strangely? My attempts to ignore what was happening crumbled when I heard soft footsteps in the hallway. They stopped at my door. A few seconds passed, and I thought I had imagined it. But then there was a knock. "Ellison." Thomas's voice was soft, almost tender. "Are you asleep?" I felt a chill run down my spine. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to respond. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is something wrong?" "I just thought we could talk a bit if you're not busy," he said. I hesitated. Everything inside me screamed not to open the door, but what if ignoring him would only make things worse? "About what?" I asked, not approaching the door. "About anything." His voice was still too soft. "We hardly ever talk, and I feel like that's wrong. We're family, Ellie." The word family sounded like a mockery coming from him. I approached the door and pressed my forehead against it. "Thomas, honestly, I'm tired. Maybe tomorrow?" I said, trying to sound convincing, and added, I just need some time to myself. Silence from the other side lasted a few seconds. Of course, he finally replied, but his tone had changed. There was no longer that exaggerated softness, only a cold calm. Tomorrow, we have plenty of time. I heard his footsteps fade away, and only then did I allow myself to exhale. But the relief was fleeting. I knew this wasn't the end. The next evening, Thomas was waiting for me in the kitchen again. This time, he had set 2 plates with dinner and lit candles. The whole setup looked strange. Foreign. He had never done this before. "Dinner's ready," he said with a slight smile, inviting me to sit down. I wanted to refuse, but I knew that would only fuel his interest. So I sat down, trying to keep my composure. "This looks nice," I said, trying to ease the tension. "Thank you. I wanted to do something special," he replied, watching me as if evaluating my reaction. We ate in silence, and this silence was unbearable. I felt his gaze literally piercing me. Thomas ate slowly, almost thoughtfully, until he finally spoke. "You know I care about you, right?" I looked up, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Yes, I know. And I hope you appreciate that," he continued. "Because it's not easy. Caring about someone who doesn't always want to share their feelings." His words sounded like a reproach, and it made me tense up. "I appreciate it, Thomas," I replied, trying to sound sincere. "I'm just going through a tough time right now." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't read. "You're right," he said. "You have a lot of stress, and that's not right." He stood up, walked around the table, and sat on the edge of my chair. His closeness was unbearable, and I moved away, but he gently placed his hand on my shoulder. "Ellison, I'm here to help you." His voice became soft, almost whispering. "You should trust me." I felt his fingers press slightly harder on my shoulder. It wasn't painful, but the sensation made me cringe inside. I stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back. "Thomas, thanks for dinner. I need to work." He didn't move, just looked at me with a slight smile that seemed more like a mask. "Of course," he finally said, stepping back. "But remember, Ellie, I'm always here." When I went up to my room and closed the door behind me, I felt my legs give way. This could no longer be ignored. His words, his gestures, everything indicated that he was trying to erase the boundary that should exist between us. I took my phone to call Mom, but stopped again. What would I tell her? She wouldn't believe me. It could all be dismissed as my fatigue or imagination. But something deep inside told me. He knows I'm afraid, and he enjoys it. I lay down on the bed, not turning on the light, and lay there, staring at the ceiling. The silence in the house seemed louder than any scream. And I knew. This was not just a game. This was a trap. The night was eerily quiet. The whole house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. Lying in bed, I felt my nerves stretched like strings, ready to snap at the slightest sound. Every creak of the floorboards outside the door, every rustle outside the window made me jump. Something was brewing, and this feeling grew with each passing second. The knock on the door came unexpectedly. Soft, hesitant, but insistent enough to make me tense up. "Ellison." Thomas's voice sounded muffled through the wooden barrier. "Are you asleep?" I tensed up, feeling fear grip me. To refuse to talk to him? Pretend to be asleep? But what would that change? "No," I finally replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is something wrong? Can I come in?" His voice had something strange in it, both tender and commanding. I hesitated. Everything inside me screamed, "No." But before I could answer, the door creaked open and Thomas entered. He closed it behind him, standing in the doorway. In the dim light, his figure seemed especially large, his gaze especially heavy. "I thought we should talk," he said, looking straight at me. "We've grown too distant from each other." "Thomas, it's late. We can discuss this tomorrow." I pressed against the headboard, feeling the tension rise. But he came closer, his steps slow, measured, as if he wanted to give me time to realize his presence. "Tomorrow," he repeated, sitting on the edge of the bed. "And what if tomorrow nothing changes?" Those words sounded too serious. I tried to keep my composure, but my heart was pounding so loudly that I was afraid he could hear it. "Thomas," I began, trying to give my voice firmness. "You're acting strangely. I don't like it." He didn't answer right away. His gaze wandered around the room, lingering on the details, on my nightstand, on the light of the nightlight, on my hands clutching the blanket. When he looked at me again, there was a mix of tenderness and something unsettling in his eyes. "Ellie," his voice lowered, "I just want you to feel comfortable. You've been so tense lately. That's not right." His hand gently rested on my shoulder. This movement wasn't rough, but it sent a chill through me. "Thomas, please," I said, moving away. "I'm tired. I need to be alone." His hand hovered in the air for a moment before he withdrew it. A smile appeared on his face, but it wasn't reassuring. There was something insistent in it. "You think I don't see how you're trying to distance yourself?" he asked, his tone becoming sterner. "You know I'm here to help you." "I don't need help," I replied, no longer trying to hide the tremor in my voice. But he didn't move. His gaze, his posture, everything indicated that he wasn't going to leave. The room suddenly felt too small. The air, too thick. "Ellison, you shouldn't be afraid of me," he said finally, his voice soft again. "We're family. I just want you to feel protected." "Thomas, I began, but my voice trailed off. He leaned in a bit closer and I felt his breath. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. Every nerve in my body screamed not to let this happen, but I couldn't move. His hand slid up again, touching my face. I recoiled, and this movement seemed to bring me back to reality. "Please go away," I said sharply, summoning all my willpower to make myself speak. He froze, his eyes intently watching me as if trying to read my thoughts. And then he stood up. He just stood up, stepped back, as if something in my reaction had stopped him. "All right," he said after a long pause. "I didn't mean to scare you, but we need to talk. You understand that?" I didn't answer. I just watched as he slowly walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the cold sweat covering my skin. When the door closed behind him, I pressed against the bed, feeling tears well up in my eyes. This was not just strangeness. This was an invasion. Thomas hadn't just crossed a boundary. He had destroyed it. That night was only the beginning of something darker, and I knew that things would only get more complicated from here. The phone in my hand trembled just as much as I did. I couldn't make myself dial the number. My fingers seemed to disobey me. What would I say? How could I explain what had been hanging in the air but never spoken aloud? The fear that had taken root in me was stronger than words. For a moment, I looked at the door. It was slightly ajar. I distinctly remember locking it last night, but now there was a gap between the door and the frame, a sinister void in my certainty. Thomas could come in. Or maybe he already had. I quickly got out of bed, feeling a chill run through me. The room seemed both larger than usual and more confined. Every corner was suspicious, every shadow hid a threat. When I went downstairs to the kitchen, Thomas was standing by the stove. His movements were measured, almost nonchalant. On the stove, water was boiling, and on the table lay 2 neatly arranged sandwiches. Everything looked so ordinary that it made my head spin from the contrast with my emotions. "Good morning, Ellison," he said without turning around. "Morning," I replied, though my voice sounded foreign. He turned to me with a smile that should have looked friendly but seemed wrong, as if it was stretched, like a mask. "How did you sleep?" he asked, studying my face. "Fine," I replied quickly, sitting down at the table. I didn't want to continue this conversation, but I knew I couldn't avoid it. "You look tired." he said, sitting down across from me. You know you can tell me if something's wrong, right? I nodded, avoiding his gaze. I took the mug of coffee and felt my hands tremble. Thomas noticed but said nothing. Instead, he leaned closer, placing his palm on the table. Ellison, I wanted to talk to you. About us. His voice was soft, but there was a threat hidden in it. I froze. Those words hit me like a blow. About us? I asked, looking at him. My heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed he could hear it too. Yes. He leaned closer. I feel like we've grown too distant from each other. That's not right. We're family. His words sounded so calm, but there was a dark power hidden in that calmness. I moved back slightly, feeling my insides tighten. Thomas, I don't know what you're talking about, I said, trying to keep my composure. Everything's fine. No, it's not. He suddenly straightened up. You're avoiding me. You're afraid of me. I can see it. But why? What did I do wrong? His voice grew louder, his gaze sharper. I felt panic rising. I'm just tired, I muttered. That's all. I have a lot of work. Work, he scoffed, leaning back. You always find excuses. At that moment, I realized everything he said was not an attempt to connect. It was a game. He was waiting for my reaction to make his next move. When Mom returned home later that day, I rushed to her like a savior. Thomas was calm, even smiled at her, as if nothing had happened. But his gaze lingered on me for a moment, and I understood that this game was not over. Later in my room, I texted a friend. I need to get away. Immediately. Thomas. He scares me. Can you help? The reply came almost instantly. Of course. I'll pick you up tomorrow at 8 a.m. I sighed with relief. This was a solution. I wouldn't let him keep me in this house, in this trap. But even with this plan, I knew ahead was still a long night, and Thomas, most likely, would not leave me alone. I turned off the light, leaving only the faint glow of the nightlight. But before I could close my eyes, there was a soft knock on the door. Ellison. Thomas's voice was soft, almost tender. We never finished our conversation. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I didn't answer. I just lay there, holding my breath, hoping he would leave. But the footsteps behind the door didn't fade. And I realized this night would be the longest in my life.